Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Dorr. I work for the International Studies Association as their Director of Professional Development. So I am here today with a fantastic panel who are going to be discussing functional coexistence. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Margarita, who will be moderating this event. Margarita?
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, depending where you are joining us. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, which is entitled Functional Coexistence in Socio-Political Conflict, Enabling Social Change Across Decades. You have been automatically warned, but want to emphasize one more time that this webinar will be recorded. Again, my name is Margarita Tadavosian. I am the Executive Director of the Center for Peacemaking Practice at the Carter School at George Mason University. And it is my pleasure today to host this and moderate the webinar and introduce an important discussion on functional coexistence, which with my colleagues we frame as a concept that offers a pragmatic perspective on how societies and communities navigate relationships of mutual non-recognition and denial while maintaining the absence of physical violence. I also would like to take this opportunity and announce that our upcoming book launch that we co-edited with Dr. Tatsushi Araya that carries the same title, Functional Coexistence in Social-Political Conflict, Enabling Social Change Across Decades. We're very grateful to generous support of our home institutions, Kent State University, where Dr. Tatsushi is from, and George Mason University, as well as McConnell Foundation for making the book available through open access, and you can find it on Routledge webpage. The book presents a very innovative and critical concept and explores the theoretical foundation of functional coexistence, real-world applications, as well as, very importantly, implications for peace-building policy and evaluation. So I really encourage you to check it out. It is available as of today on the Routledge webpage. We have an excellent panel of very distinguished scholars and practitioners with us who are going to be presenting very unique perspective, bringing a very unique perspective to our discussion. We will start with Dr. Tatsushi Araya from, again, Kent State University, and he will be talking about the conceptual foundations and significance of the concept. Dr. Sun-Young Ling from Soka University, Japan, and Dr. Roger McGuinty from Durham University will be discussing, presenting the application of this concept in case studies of Cambodia during the Khmer Rouge, in post-Khmer Rouge Cambodia, as well as interesting concept of dysfunctional, functional application of coexistence in Northern Ireland. And last but not least, Dr. Jeff Helsings, the Executive Director of the Better Evidence Project from George Mason University, will present a broader landscape of functional coexistence and talk about lessons learned and applications for further inquiry. I want to talk a little bit about how we will proceed. Each panelist will present their make their presentation, and then after all four presentations are complete, we'll open the floor for questions and discussions. Please utilize the Q&A feature on the Zoom to submit your questions, and we'll try to get to them as many questions as possible in the time allocated. And of course, we welcome your comments, reflections, and observations as we go through this presentation. And with that, I'm honored to turn it over to our first speaker, Dr. Tatsushi Araya, who will introduce the conceptual foundations. Tatsushi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Margarita. Hello, welcome everyone. Wonderful to meet you through this virtual space. The task in front of me is to introduce a concept of functional coexistence. And the title of the book was already mentioned by Margarita. I'm going to start this presentation with a little bit of a personal journey that I have been engaged in. That started as an NGO representative working in Israel, Palestine back in 2007, 2009, facilitating dialogues, doing training, expansion learning sessions. Long story short, from that experience, I was struck by the importance of looking at mutual recognition, non-recognition, in particular, asking questions like, could there be a peace building or even a peace process that assumes mutual non-recognition as a starting point? And that was a rather emergent question within me, but I subsequently spent 5 years during the civil war in Syria, training Syrian civil society, government, humanitarian professionals. It is through those workshops that the idea of functional coexistence got crystallized, and I was convinced that we should develop a well-developed, formulated theory about functional coexistence. But let me get into more of a systematic and slightly academic inquiry of functional coexistence here. During the past decades, many of us in our field have really sought common ground between opposing parties for conflict resolution. Recently, we have seen the rise of some literature that tries to explore how to stay constructively engaged in an enduring state of conflict non-resolution. Bernard Meyer, Oliver Ramsbottom, among other people. I'm going to just connect this latter line of thought to a decade I spent in Myanmar, especially in western part of Myanmar, where I frequented the Rohingya IDP camps, as well as the Arakanese people. Arakanese, a Buddhist majority community in western Myanmar, living in the area where Rohingyas live. Basically, if you go to each one of the IDP camps or places of residence and ask about the other side, the majority, if not all of them, basically said in each one of the communities, do not talk about finding common ground. Do not even think of reconciliation. That is dehumanizing. And voices like this I heard in the context of Syria, Palestine, and this seeking common ground is definitively something I, as well as many other colleagues, seek. This is really a thing that we should do. But at the same time, there are contexts where the notion of coexistence, common ground itself, can be seen as dehumanizing, as a non-starter. And in search of a useful starting point to address deeper issues such as this, I'm going to just consult a work on enduring conflict, Bernard Meyer. And I'm showing an image of deep woven roots because this symbolic image is quite illustrative. I'm going to quote Bernard Meyer here. Enduring conflict is that aspect of the dispute that is embedded in structures, systems, values, and identity, and will therefore not be resolved through short-term, resolution-oriented conflict interventions. Enduring conflict is long-lasting because of its nature, not because of ineffective or inappropriate efforts to resolve it. Till the roots of the conflict change, the system evolves, or the identity of value-based elements are profoundly transformed, the conflict will remain, although how it is manifested may vary over time. To me, this is a very important statement in the field. And this is in line with the existing work on intractable conflict, protracted social conflict, but it goes further in my view. And I'm going to just elaborate on what goes further in my view. Now, time has come for me to define functional coexistence. By functional coexistence, I am referring to the intersection of the two potentially contradicting realms of social relations. One is enduring negative peace. That is a sustained absence of direct physical violence. The other is a state of mutual denial or mutual non-recognition. Typically, we call the latter existential relationship or conflict. If you have those two, usually they don't coexist. They're contradicting. But as you see, there are many contexts where these two seemingly contradictory tendencies can coexist and last for decades. So succinctly put, functional coexistence is a pragmatic relationship of mutual denial or mutual recognition, sustained for decades in the absence of direct physical violence. What are some of the contexts that inspire me to articulate functional coexistence? And these examples are presently demonstrating functional coexistence are potentially relevant to functional coexistence. The word potentially is emphasized here. Yet in the initial formulation of functional coexistence I developed in 2022, I used the Taiwan mainland China relations, East-West German relations as case studies. However, North and South Korea-US relations, Afghan-Taliban-Washington relations, these are two additional examples. Potentially, Rohingya-Rakhine-Burma relations, Sinhalese-Tamil Muslim relations in Sri Lanka could also be applicable. Italicized contexts are the ones in which I have relatively deep hands-on experience. In the future, there could be a potential of functional coexistence, or what we call functional coexistence approach in a moment, to be applicable to Israel, Palestine, Israel, Iran, as well as to Russia, Ukraine, NATO relations, potentially. Now, in order to just advance this discussion further, I need to say a little bit about what happens within decades of absence of violence on the one hand, and the presence of mutual denial. And I'm going to be using the Taiwan Strait conflict as an illustrative case study here. And what I'm doing here is to show a Cartesian space whereby on the y-axis you have the gradation from more individual-based relationship to more collective relationship, group versus individual. On the y-axis, I'm showing the range between more informal relationship to more formal relationship. By saying more formal, I'm talking about more organized and institutionalized. Within this XY axis, there can be so many different levels of relationship possible. And we call this shifting boundaries of mutual non-recognition. Why? Because as in cross-strait relations, there is a perceived boundary that parties cannot cross. Because this is existential conflict. There are things that they cannot do. But look at the last 7 to 8 decades of cross-strait relations, where one China policy is absolute. Taiwan is not. Taiwan is part of China, whereas, of course, Taipei says something else. But within this context, in 1992, there was a tacit agreement called 1992 consensus between the two sides, loosely accepting different interpretations of one China. And that was good enough to start administrative exchanges that culminated in a de facto free trade agreement 2010, controversial nevertheless. And in 2015, there was a first cross-strait summit that was realized. I emphasize that as of 2025, cross-strait relations are in a very critical and, in a sense, a dangerous situation. So some of those rapprochement attempts have been reversed. But my basic point stays that what appears to be non-negotiable boundary within the context of mutual denial or at least non-recognition has shifted dramatically. My point is that if the boundaries of non-recognition actually shift from a decades-old perspective, can we apply the dynamic understanding, not so much of a static understanding of something that is commonly referred to as a frozen conflict? And here we are proposing something called a functional coexistence approach to conflict intervention, distinguishing functional coexistence as an empirical descriptive concept to this normative prescriptive idea that takes elastic boundaries of non-recognition seriously and apply that awareness of macrohistorical change, gradual change, into more proactive intervention and peace-building activities. And here on the screen, what you see is the pyramid. It's Jean-Paul Ledulac adapted within regional global context. We offer 4 guideposts to functional coexistence approach. Number 1 is to develop parties' historical consciousness of the shifting boundaries of mutually acceptable conflict behavior, as shown in close-rate relations. Number 2 is to find a constructive way of staying engaged in the enduring state of conflict non-resolution. In other words, simply because non-resolution is there, do not run away. Do not stop investing. Stay engaged. Find a way. Number 3, act on a multi-layered structural view of conflict intervention while resisting the inertia of hegemonic stability and submissive inaction. The diagram on the right basically shows that functional coexistence is not A versus B. It is structured. And sometimes, not always, but the grassroots level is more malleable than track 1, or the other way around. So have a structural view and engage strategically. And the final point is to make use of short-term actions to foster enabling conditions, keyword, enabling conditions for long-term systemic change. Let me elaborate on this last point because it's a key point for functional coexistence approach. Whenever we are actually in the context of mutual denial, non-recognition, the space in which we engage is very limited. So what we can do best is usually short-term, time-bound actions or projects. But can we intentionally gear those projects toward long-term processes and patterns, which may not lead to conflict transformation immediately, but which will guide us to create conditions for eventual conflict transformation? Better yet, can we put this short-term, long-term framework in the Cartesian space, systemic structural Cartesian space I put, and think of the short-term, long-term much more structurally and strategically? Now, our book has 3 types of case studies. The first type of case studies have to do with something called enduring functional coexistence that has lasted for over 2 to 3 decades of negative peace and non-recognition denial. Cambodia is one example. Sunyoung is going to present. Cyprus is another. Northern Ireland yet another. Roger is going to present on this one. And Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo. We added another layer of case study inquiry that is something called transitional context of coexistence. This is not functional coexistence, but we see at least a decade of negative peace plus some signs of non-recognition and denial. Margarita did a great job in articulating Armenia-Turkey relations in this respect to illustrate this. And finally, we add a very important an imaginative category called potential emergence of functional coexistence that refers to ongoing contexts of non-recognition and non-resolution, non-recognition, in which functional coexistence is potentially useful as a way forward. There may be violence going on, but if these cases are going to last, perhaps the most likely scenario is to go through functional coexistence. Examples include Arab-Jewish relations in Israel and Armenia-Azerbaijan relations. Jeff's summary and synthesis is going to take into account all these 3 types. So that's it from me.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you for setting us to move forward and being aware of the time. I want to give the floor to Sunyoung, who's going to be talking about the case of Cambodia.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Song-Young Lee. I'm working at Soka University in Japan as a faculty member in Peace and Conflict Studies. I also prepared for a short presentation slide here. As Todd mentioned, functional coexistence takes place between various social groups at different levels. And the features of functional coexistence can vary according to the types of actors involved. And this chapter, in this regard, aims to tease out some features that are particularly relevant to the community level by looking at the context of post-Khmer Rouge Cambodia. The relevant data was collected from my field research conducted in 3 geographical locations in this country: Phnom Penh, Battambang, and Svay Rieng between 2018 and 2022. I interviewed 26 participants. 4 of them were former Khmer Rouge cadres, and the remaining 22 were the community members who survived the Khmer Rouge rule. Regarding the context of Cambodia, I'm not going to get into so much details, but I at least want to mention that the Khmer Rouge had operated an extremely radical and violent so-called social revolution, and it caused an estimated 1.5 million deaths. And you can imagine that after this catastrophe ended, people were subject to combined impact of strong anger against the Khmer Rouge, strong sense of exhaustion from long-term violence, and fear of the risk of the Khmer Rouge return. So what types of functional coexistence emerged in this context and how? And my chapter addresses this question by looking at 3 types of actions mobilized over time: the prevention of revenge killing, non-recognition, and acquiescence and unofficial recognition. So during the earliest phase of Cambodia's transition from the Khmer Rouge era, community members who had suffered under Khmer Rouge rule frequently staged revenge attacks on the former local Khmer Rouge cadres living in the same communities. Such revenge killing took place across the country, often seriously exacerbating local security. So in response to the violence, a large number of community leaders took actions to discourage the revenge killing. Because they had almost no material resources to utilize, they considered local dialogue as an affordable and accessible means that they could utilize for discouraging violence. And in order to make their action more effective, these community leaders adopted the narratives that appealed to traditional maxims and familiar Buddhist concepts. But what's important here is that these people didn't intend to accept or recognize those former Khmer Rouge cadres as a legitimate part of their communities. Instead, their actions focused on or limited to preventing further violence. And in this process, they strove to remain sensitive to the community members' strong resentment toward the Khmer Rouge. And revenge killing had by and large disappeared. Community members shifted their attention to the need to ensure stable working relationship with former Khmer Rouge associates. Overall, I found 2 types of relationship building here. The firstly, non-recognition was a type of interaction that the community members with deep anxiety adopted. These members took collective action for social shunning of former Khmer Rouge leaders. Sometimes it was presented in the form of physical exclusion, preventing them from living in the communities. In other cases, these former Khmer Rouge leaders managed to live in local villages and carry on basic economic and public activities like grocery shopping. However, members of the local communities excluded them from almost all major community events like weddings and funerals, and they also refused any social interactions with them. And the second point, the avoidance is another type of non-recognition, which is undertaken by individuals who hoped to forget or downplay the traumatizing memory of the past. For these people, thinking of the previous atrocity consumed a lot of energy, triggered an emotional pain, so they chose to prioritize the present and avoid recalling difficult experiences of the past. And the acquiescence and unofficial recognition are more conciliatory actions. But these kind of actions are usually offered to the Khmer Rouge leaders who had been more sympathetic to them during the Khmer Rouge rule. So local community members were more willing to tolerate their participation to the community activities. But even in such cases, many people felt it was difficult to simply forgive them. Also, they feared that their actions of being kind to these local Khmer Rouge cadres might trigger some criticisms from other community members. So community members cautiously adopted indirect and subtle actions to express their acceptance. So these are the very cursory summary of the 3 types of actions that people in many local communities of Cambodia had promoted. Then what impact did the functional coexistence had on the intergroup relations in the local communities of Cambodia? Today, let me just spend the remaining time to elaborate on 2 points. Firstly, it helped the community members overcome the simplified images of the Khmer Rouge leaders. So in the early period, many people treated these local leaders as the Khmer Rouge and wanted to express their anger against them. However, the enduring state of functional coexistence enabled the community members to process their deep-seated resentment and gradually put those negative feelings to rest. They recalled and assessed individual leaders' roles, behavior, and attitude they had observed during the Khmer Rouge era. And these experiences of self-reflection and sense-making made it possible for many of those community members to break down the monolithic image of the Khmer Rouge leaders and accepted individual leaders as distinct human beings. And theoretical debates, social categorization that divides people simply as in-group and out-group has been considered a critical barrier to social reconciliation. I'm sure that many of you can recall a large number of studies that revealed the challenges by the simplistic intergroup bias and explored how to reduce it in the post-conflict setting, right? In this regard, the Cambodian case demonstrates an example of why and how such a reduction of simplistic categorization can happen at local community level. And finally, related to the concept of functional coexistence that all the co-authors actually explored together in this volume, this case study of Cambodia presents a quite unique example of elastic boundaries of mutual non-recognition. So according to Arai, or Tuts, these boundaries correspond to dynamics and contested manners in which functional coexistence evolves over time. So he further explains that when interactions are more individual-oriented and informal, individuals have more opportunities to exercise greater freedom in determining their relationship with out-group members. I thought my chapter on Cambodia demonstrated exactly this point. Individuals from different groups constantly interact and closely observe the behavior and attitude of each other at local markets, schools, places of worship, and government offices, etc., and etc. Hence, the community members developed a quite complex and multidimensional view of each individual that they encounter. I thought it is quite a unique opportunity that only the close-knit local communities may offer, and quite rarely available at national and international levels, as illustrated by the conflict across the Taiwan Strait or North and South Korea relations. So that's kind of summary of what I had observed in my chapter. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Sun Young. Thank you for this thorough presentation. And now we're going to move on to Roger, who's going to be speaking about Northern Ireland and the dynamic between functionality and dysfunctionality of coexistence there. Please, Roger.
Thank you, Margarita, and thank you and congratulations to both you and to Tats for shepherding this project and book to fruition. It did involve some functional coexistence. The very act of editing a book involves quite a few of those skills. And it's wonderful to follow Sung Young because although Song Young is talking about the case of Cambodia, much of what he says resonates with my thinking and my observations on Northern Ireland. I think it's extremely timely that we see this volume, because it's important that we conceptualize how people live with conflict, and how coexistence and conflict are incredibly common to operate simultaneously. But we need to unpack that. And my approach in looking at Northern Ireland was to unpack the notion of functional within the wider concept of functional coexistence. And I have a number of questions pertaining to functionality. The first is functional for who? And to me, that's often a question about intersectionality. It's a question about gender, it's a question about class, caste, power, ability, disability. A second question is who enables this functionality? This gets us to questions of power and agency, but also a minimum level of security. There needs to be a minimal level of security to enable people to function, to enable society to function, and to enable institutions to function. And then a third question in relation to functionality is, well, functional in what domain or sector? Are we talking about the economy, the polity, the everyday? And clearly this is going to vary according to time and geography. At some stages, societies are tense and fragile, maybe due to an election or an anniversary. But at other times, things calm down. And of course, geography really matters, particularly microgeographies, particularly the intimate geographies of where we live. What interests me, as I said at the outset, is this coexistence of functionality and dysfunctionality. They exist simultaneously. They're involved in this constant process of negotiation and navigation. And it's not just a whole of society functionality. It leaches down to the everyday, to the local, to the hyperlocal. And we can think of circumstances, not just in Northern Ireland, but very much so thinking about Cambodia in the previous section, but also all of the cases in this book, in which there are elements of functionality and dysfunctionality sitting side by side or contained one within the other. And that's fascinating. And I'm going to come to that in the conclusion. So to Northern Ireland, which had a peace accord 25 years ago, almost 26 years ago, in a sense, it's a settled case of peace accords. It seems to be, and I think this is a question for all of us in the peace and conflict studies community, but it seems to be that the Northern Ireland Peace Accord, the Dayton Peace Accord, and a number of other peace accords are historical artifacts, that we are currently in a post-peace accord and post-peace agreement era in which there is no more peacemaking. There is conflict management, if we're lucky, and very often it's authoritarian conflict management. So in a way, the Northern Ireland case, the Cyprus case, the Cambodian case may not be indicators of the future in some ways. So in terms of Northern Ireland, whether we can class it as being functional or dysfunctional, it really depends on storytelling, the story you want to tell. And many of our stories are patterned by ideology of where we want to go and our belief system. It also depends on all of those intersectional aspects of gender, of class, of ability or disability. I'm sitting in Northern Ireland at the moment. I look out the window. It looks entirely functional to me. I did the school drop-off this morning. I'll do the school pickup later on. I'll go to the store. I'll get groceries. It's a functional society. But if I was economically excluded, if I was disabled, if I was in an area with drug-related crime, which might be controlled by legacy militant groups, then I would have a different opinion. So gender, class, ability, geography really matters. And Northern Ireland really is both functional and dysfunctional. So the story of functionality, well, as I mentioned, there is this long-standing peace accord, which is largely intact. And with it, there is a power-sharing assembly, which is largely intact. 2024 was the first year since the 1960s in which there had not been a security-related death. Now, that's quite phenomenal for a society that was known as being somewhere that's suffering from widespread political violence. Basic services are functional. The state functions. There is an everyday accommodation between people. There are not confrontations on the ground in every town and village. So that's the story of functionality. But there's also a story of dysfunction as well that can be told alongside the first story. This is a society in which almost 50% of people do not accept the constitutional arrangement. Almost 50% of people want to see Northern Ireland move from being within the United Kingdom to the Republic of Ireland. In other words, the state lacks legitimacy amongst a substantial section of the population. 80% of people vote for political parties that are either in favour of United Ireland or in favour of the union with the United Kingdom. 90% of children go to single identity schools. They're educated either as Catholics or Protestants. Very often, many issues are seen through a sectarian lens. No matter what the issue, it's seen in a binary way. Even COVID was regarded as being somehow sectarian. And there is massive self-imposed segregation. Most people in Northern Ireland live in a residential area in which their group is the majority. And that has huge implications for schooling, for everyday life, in terms of cultural consumption, the sport people play, the places they socialize, the newspapers they read, the radio stations they listen to. So I'm undecided whether Northern Ireland can be called functional or dysfunctional. In fact, it's both. And I was really struck by something that Sung Young said earlier, in relation to the case of Cambodia, in which he said, Cambodia has elastic boundaries of mutual denial of non-recognition, one of the key criteria for functional coexistence. And that applies to Northern Ireland as well, in that some people deny the existence of others, but very many people begrudgingly accept the existence of the outgroup. But let me finish by using the term, a provocative term, the curse of functionality. In many ways, we should celebrate functionality. People aren't being killed. People aren't being imprisoned. That is a good thing. Kids get to school. There is food on the grocery store shelves. But this minimum level of functionality, this begrudging coexistence, enables Northern Ireland to limp along. there is no major push from negative peace to positive peace. In other words, the society is in a multi-generation holding pattern. So there's a trade-off between longevity on the one hand and the quality of the peace on the other hand. And Northern Ireland seems to be stuck with this minimum level of coexistence, as Tats calls it, this minimal livable situation. And at the same time, there is a break on the system, which does not allow it to progress to higher quality peace. So let me finish by thanking both Margarita and Tats, because Northern Ireland is a case that is overstudied, that there's very little new to say on it, but I'm very grateful for them promoting and developing this idea of functional coexistence, because it allowed me to then think innovatively, I hope, about a legacy case of a peace process. It allowed me to apply an innovative concept to an old case study, and I'm deeply grateful for that. So thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you so much. Last but not least, I will turn to Dr. Jeff Helsing, who's going to present on broader landscape of functional coexistence and lessons learned and how it can be further studied in the field. Please, Jeff.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. My task just got considerably more difficult because I spent much of my time taking notes while listening to Sung-Young and Roger. This is it's an interesting topic because, as you've heard, the cases themselves are both very rich, but they're significantly diverse. And there is no particular model of functional coexistence. Each of the case really projects different states or different applications of functional coexistence, or functional coexistence, to be redundant, functions differently in these different cases. And what I was trying to do in my contribution to this project was to see where there were commonalities. What was it that we could take away from these different cases, some of which have been enduring for decades, and others are examples of what I would call potential aspirations, in the sense that functional coexistence may provide a pathway to negative peace and ultimately potentially constructive engagement that could lead to a more formal, settled peace. And I think it's important to reiterate what Roger just said about, a peace agreement doesn't necessarily resolve the problems that are at the root of the conflict in the first place. And I was struck by his notion that we may be in a post-agreement world. And that made me think of sort of a lot of the work that I'm doing now, or engaging with many people in Colombia, in which, interestingly, they are wrestling with some of the same issues that have emerged in our conversation to this point. One of the things I wanted to note was that functional coexistence isn't static. And I think this book shows that it's not just something that, well, it's sort of reflective of negative peace. There isn't violence or people aren't dying. That being said, it does need, and I think Roger used this term in his chapter, tending to, that it does require something in terms of peace building and in conflict resolution tools and skills. It is not just something that one can say, well, it's good because there is, in a sense, an absence of violence. So let me just talk quickly about the four kind of key themes that really, to my mind, emerged from this work. The first seems to be that economic well-being and a perception of well-being, but particularly economic well-being, seems to create important incentives for continued and evolving engagement. That is, in Roger's right to point out that there will be those who do not necessarily benefit from functional coexistence, but it is strengthened when most in the society, or a significant majority, believe that they are better off with the status quo than in particular change. They are not going to work to change the situation. So, and a lot of it, particularly if we look at the case of Cyprus in this book, economic well-being has slowly transformed how many in Cyprus understand the conflict and how they engage with the other. The second is that, and this is where I think peace building can really be leveraged in sort of improving and strengthening functional coexistence to a point that constructive engagement is more possible. And that is the creation of, or the sustaining of, disincentives for violence. So the stronger the disincentives for violence, the greater the possibility of attitudinal and behavioral changes. It's not inevitable, but that is absolutely a critical sort of foundation for the potential for more positive peace building. And what functional coexistence can do is provide the space for trust building and potential negotiations, because there's an expectation that violence can be reduced. And if we look at the cases of, or the more transitional cases, that is sort of the goal, what may be possible. And it really revolves around an acceptance or a belief that violence is counterproductive. It is no longer in the self-interest of the parties to engage further in violence. And so that shift is particularly remarkable and particularly significant as a basis for these, for the success of functional coexistence. I just also want to reiterate one of the things that Roger said, and was very much at the heart of what Seong-Yong was getting at, and that is, this is not possible until and unless there is a perceived sense by all parties of the sustained assurance of minimum security and survival. And that gets to what may be one of the most fascinating cases in this book. And that is the one that Mohammed Abu-Nimer did on Jewish-Arab relations within Israel. And one of the things that he mentioned was that that functional coexistence has not really taken root there because of power asymmetries and what he called a sort of long-standing effort on the part of mainstream Israeli Jewish society to force accommodation on the part of the Palestinians. And that too often the Palestinians have not had an incentive to sort of exist, to feel that functional coexistence was in their best interest. And Palestinians, even in Israel, as Mohammed points out, too often do not benefit from economic well-being and do not feel a sense of minimal security. In addition, as we've seen, and this relates to the cases that focus on Armenia, is that in those cases, and including the Israeli-Palestinian case, that the regional context or what's happening outside of the borders can be particularly significant in shaping the landscape for what's possible in true constructive engagement. The last thing I'll mention as just one of the key sort of themes that I saw in this was that a functional coexistence approach can really assist in transformation from enmity to engagement over time and incrementally. And it does so sort of through a pattern of engagement, small steps, incremental, that can help perpetuate or help create positive relationships, particularly at a local and functional level, meaning a very small scale, but individual or small community level. And that seems to be the pattern where functional coexistence has been more successful. One of the cases, the one in the Western Balkans, that is where that case remains somewhat fragile because those groups remain so segregated and antagonistic that there has been less progress in constructive engagement because it hasn't worked incrementally at the individual level. And so the last thing I'll sort of lay out is in trying to provide some conclusions about this, is that functional coexistence is both a positive sign for what may be possible in terms of transitioning to more constructive engagement that could lead to a sustainable peace in which parties in communities in the societies either believe in or feel they have a stake in and want to sustain, as opposed to just finding a way to live without violence among themselves. And what I think this reflects in, and this goes back to when Tots quoted Bernard Meyer, and that is too often in the peace building field that we focus on resolution of conflicts as our only entire purpose and focus, and that we don't necessarily give enough attention to dealing with conflicts that are ongoing, that are deeply rooted, and that need to that the first step becomes the importance of preventing and ensuring violence doesn't reemerge. And so in many ways, functional coexistence provides a framework for prescriptive thinking and action, but based upon the prospect of transformation. And we think of conflict transformation as being very much rooted in positive peace, but in fact, the need for transformation actually is just as important when there is this sort of sustained coexistence in which violence does not necessarily exist or is not prevalent, but requires incentives and interventions to help these societies get to the next step. So the last thing in many ways is that I conclude my chapter by saying that functional coexistence is intended to continue a state of nonviolence while, and this is the key, while at the same time, if possible, enabling the relationship between conflicting parties to evolve, or can we help that evolution into more constructive engagement? And so functional coexistence has sort of seeded the ground, but it requires then the next steps to till, tend, and see and help new seeds of not just coexistence, but constructive engagement to emerge. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. And I think your chapter was really brilliant, and also synthesizing and making sense of all this different geographic context and conflict context. It was a very difficult job that you. Thank you for that. And I want to now open up the floor for question and answers. We do have several questions in the chat. One is about the application of functional coexistence for the context of Armenia and Azerbaijan, and I would like to say that we have a chapter on that. I really encourage you to read that, but as I'm going to take the moderator role and try to answer this as person who stands closer to the conflict, this particular conflict context. And I think both Roger and Jeff mentioned this. And Todd said in the beginning that we consider, for the purposes of functional coexistence, Armenia, Azerbaijan as a case of a potential emergence of or application of functional coexistence, because one of the very important components for this, the absence of negative peace, does not really exist currently in this context, or it's not sustained at least for a decade, given the recent political changes and escalations. However, what the functional coexistence approach can be very useful is helping to find that space between two maximalistic approaches of either war or peace, while acknowledging the mutual non-recognition and denial and all the nationalistic narratives that you have mentioned in your question, still find for a way of pragmatic engagement and figuring out some of the questions that are on the table about the borders, about demarcation, about potential like corridors, about trade agreements, about possible movements of the population. So those are this kind of pragmatic elements that can be something that conflict parties can continue to constructively engage while they are still debating bigger pieces on the within the peace agreement. I would like to direct the next question to anyone who wants to take, and the question is about how we move from the negative piece that functional coexistence entails to building the positive piece, and who should be leading that. Is it a community focused? Who do you think is able to lead that process? Yes, Roger.
I think it's a really good question from Flora. And to me, it's a question of who are the leaders and where are the leaders. And what we see in different societies is that sometimes leaders are in the elite, and sometimes, very often, in fact, there's a lot of community leaders. And one of the interesting things that I see looking at multiple polities is how skilled political elites are in locking out community leaders, in closing off and monopolizing spaces for conversation, positive spaces for conversation, and turning conversations into very binary, for and against, in-group, out-group spaces. So I think what happens in a lot of societies is that neighborhoods and streets and apartment blocks find their own level. If people have a minimum level of security, they have to get the kids to school. They have to get medicine for granny. So they get on with life, and in so doing, often they demonstrate coexistence and they push boundaries a little. Now, this isn't going to spark major constitutional change, but what it does do is show this everyday agency that people have, and how they can eke out spaces of conciliation, spaces of coexistence. And I think one of the mistakes we all make is that we take political leaders far too seriously, and they get all of our attention. And actually, there's lots of leadership on the ground. It's small leadership, but often it's taking very big steps. And I think one of the nice things that we've seen about our discipline over the past 15 years is a decentering of elites in many of our studies. I'm not saying they're unimportant, but we're looking more fruitfully, I think, at communities, at neighborhoods, at that micro level.
Thank you, Roger. If there are no anyone else want to address that? Yes, Sunyon.
If I may, I just want to add a couple of points to the excellence, statement Roger just shared. More probably from as a former field practitioners, when I focused on the relations and interactions between external actors and peace builders and the local community members, who is going to lead the answers to this question can really depend on that local context. For example, when I actually engaged in the community members and the local NGOs in Mindanao, the Philippines, many people said that, well, we have brilliant ideas, we have a bunch of ideas, but we don't really have material resources to implement it. So just give us money. So in those cases, I think the external's roles really need to assist what locals actually wanted to implement. But my limited experience in Cambodia in between 2004 and 2006, I often actually came across the situation. I go and ask for their actually ideas, and they often say that we really don't have idea. That's why we want you to come. So in those cases, we need a lot more deeper kind of engagement to really, bring about the ideas that they have. And, honestly, as an individual, I came across some situation to say that it seems like they really don't have an idea. We really need more kind of inspiration from externals as well. So depending on where we go, what context we deal with, I think the answers can be different. But what's common from my perspectives is motivation. So when we really focus on, community members, we need to appreciate to promote positive peace may not necessarily be their priority. Promoting further peace, particularly when they have this quite sustainable, functional coexistence, they may feel that, yeah, we are fine. Everyday security is there, and I have no problem in engaging in my own everyday economic activities, and we don't necessarily actually now hate with each other. We really need better peace. When people have that kind of mentality, sometimes external stimuli is needed, really in order to, share what can be achieved further and why it's so important for us and for them at the same time. So, when we really focus on this community level motivation, I thought that external's role can be quite positive, when it particularly when we focus on the motivation things. Yeah.
And I just add one thing about the role of external actors. It's sort of a flip of what Sung Young just said, because I have worked with and engaged with many local actors who actually do have great ideas. They come together and they get shot down or they're undermined by political leaders or those that, and so where external actors can be particularly important is to help sort of put pressure on or find ways to get local authorities or national authorities to actually not be afraid of the change that is being proposed at the local level. And so, because that there are very rich ideas that oftentimes do emerge locally.
Thank you. I want to take this question from someone who have not identified themselves, but I want to kind of pose this to Todd because I know that at some point we were trying to have like an additional chapter in the book that addresses kind of the digital space as well. And so the question is about what challenges or opportunities does the digital space present for functional coexistence?
I want to address this question at two levels. One is an immediate response to the intent of this question. The second is to take this wonderful question to a new level and kind of articulate where I'm going with this functional coexistence for the coming years in terms of my own work. The first level is that a cyberspace, a diffusion of cyber technology at the grassroots level has really multiplied the capacity and the speed at which we can diffuse the messages. The second is that the digital space can be anonymous with respect to the senders as well as the recipients of the message. And these things have huge implications for what kind of violence is propagated, who propagates the violence. And the violence is not only direct physical, but also symbolic. Johan Galtung says cultural violence, for example. And denial, non-recognition can also be expressed. Conversely, is true as well. Gestures of conciliation or more accommodating coexistence can also be shared and propagated in cyberspace. So, our presentation focused more on the physical space, but if you include cyberspace, either the positive effect for accommodation or conciliation, negative effect or violence, it magnifies fast, encompassing a large number of people. But as I said, I'm going to just take this wonderful question to a new level here. And essentially, if you're interested, you can look at chapter 13, in which I explore the future of the functional coexistence practices and thinking. We are thinking of decades of changelessness as well as gradual change. But the decades we explored in this book are mainly at the 20th century and 21st century. But decades moving forward are going to be a different kinds of decades. where the digital technology will continue to grow. Artificial intelligence can weaponize conventional weapons or does something that mimics the human consciousness. Global energy transformation, whether you like it or not, is going to be the trend. Renewable energy, oil, gas, other industries' relative importance will perhaps change. Climate change will create different kinds of disasters and resilience that becomes important. Demographic shifts, especially the rise of African population and declining East Asian and other population, will have a global shift. The point is that the next 2 to 3 decades or even 5 decades are characterized by accelerating paces of ground shifting changes. They interact with each other. So the decades of thinking that we apply to this book are going to become obsolete. We are aware of this. So staying engaged is a concept, but the reality of staying engaged in 2050, 2075, 2200 is going to be a really different way of thinking. And part of this, we actually saw, in my view, from how October 7th, the Hamas attack, and prior to that, the Russian military operation attack in Ukraine, with that, and Israeli military operation and tit for tat between Iran and Israel, Yemen, Hezbollah with Iran, and then ceasefire. Then everyone, look what happened in Syria. Assad regime collapsed. Who could have imagined 2 years, 3 years ago that Assad regime could collapse? It is a combination of those things that made it possible for Russia not to engage and Assad to collapse. There are many other factors. But I'm kind of deviating here from AI to cyberspace to other things. But our field has to think far more seriously than before in the 21st century about how those tectonic plate shifts interact and what intervention looks like, what decades-long engagement actually look like, and how change becomes a norm, both for the reality and our mindset. So I'm using the frame called contextual transformation to capture this. And this will be one of the very important projects I'm working on. How do you actually foresee contextual shifts upon which conflict is happening? And how do we kind of make our mind elastic about the notion and manner of engagement? So I kind of flew from the cyberspace, wonderful cyberspace question to a larger question. But I think, because Jeff's presentation ended definitely with the gradualist approach being important, I also want to just bring into that 21st century dimension to couple with that and say, there's going to be a future work on functional coexistence, thinking of the seismic shift.
Thank you, Tats. I know that we run out of time, but I do want to, we have a lot of questions still in the question and answer section, but I want to quickly just pick a couple that are addressing U.S. domestic context specifically now and gauge your thoughts about this before we wrap up. There is a question whether the contentious but nonviolent politics can transition into functional coexistence, and does that exist between right and left currently in the U.S., and whether this concept can be applied to race relations, let's say inside prisons within the United States, at least. If we can kind of take those two questions before we wrap up, please.
Maybe Jeff, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think about the U.S. domestic context a lot. Yeah. And one of the things that I think is interesting is I think that we may be seeing kind of a degradation of social relations in the United States, so that we're kind of moving backwards towards greater enmity and greater polarization. One of the things that Roger said that I did think about immediately at the time, because I was started to think about the U.S. and the fact that we're becoming a more, in some ways, politically segregated society, and people tend to kind of hear only from their own particular lens or their own media. Neighborhoods tend to be reflective of people's values increasingly. But then I started thinking, okay, but sports teams, that hasn't yet been where we're seeing sort of, an identification of a particular sports team with a particular political identity. Although there has been a little bit with there were conspiracy theories about the Kansas City Chiefs football team, because the football powers that be want to increase the viewership of women. And so because Taylor Swift is dating one of the members of the team, that's a political statement and it's exploitation. But having said that, I don't mean to trivialize the question, but I do think it's legitimate to ask that question now. And what is it that we can do as peace builders to affect the polarization that we are seeing? And so I think it is an important challenge to consider.
Thank you, Jeff. Not easy questions to answer. Do you have any concluding thoughts, Todd, before we?
Okay. I was just looking at all the questions. I'm so eager to answer each and every one of the questions that will help us go deeper. But in the interest of time, I would like to encourage participants to look at the opening 3 chapters and really understand what functional coexistence is and what functional coexistence is not. I also want to emphasize that not everything that is not yet violent shouldn't be treated as functional coexistence. Just to be cautioned that, I would further add that we are never replacing the existing mainstream idea of conflict transformation, peace building. We like to see resolution. And basically, functional coexistence approach is repurposing of so many things. But to point out, there are realms of social activities that have been forgotten because they are seen as frozen. There's no more policy investment or funding necessary. There's no mediator coming. Those places. But lessons from those places shed light on large-scale ongoing conflicts, such as the Middle East and Russia-Ukraine, in my view, because it's not going to be possible to see a loving coexistence that emerges out of a ceasefire. So some of the applications are analogical, not 100% application of functional coexistence approach, but insights from functional coexistence and functional coexistence approach by analogy apply to some portion of what's less than a functional coexistence state that is, for example, violent, and so on and so forth. So just to really clarify the distinction between functional coexistence approach and then things that justify use functional coexistence as an escape to say, they don't have to do serious peace process. We are not saying that. Just to be very clear on this one.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. I have put the link to the book in the chat. Hopefully everyone can access it. Again, thank you for our supporters. The book is available via open access. I regret that we couldn't get to all the questions, but it means that this sparked the discussion, and I encourage you to continue the conversations beyond this webinar, and we're always happy to engage more and answer the questions. Kate is putting additional information about the upcoming events that ISA is putting together. Please join them. Interesting and engaging discussions. And thank you, everyone. Tots, Roger, Jeff, and Sun Young. And thank you, ISA, for hosting this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.